Good to see you again. Twice in as many days. Yes. I need some sugar this morning.
Hi, everybody. We are going to start on time. So, thank you all for coming back for the second day of the contemporary Piyyut. I do want to say about the first panel that we have now. Almog has very astutely raised the irony of the panel. We have two papers in this panel called Reclaiming the Piyyut Beyond the Table Surrounded by Men, and appropriately, this is going to be a table surrounded by men. I want to say we are aware of that. I am completely at fault for setting up this table, but I do want to highlight this. Maybe this will become part of the conversation on this is by no means a gender representative table of this conference, but I think it's an interesting topic to talk about the gender dynamics, not only of the materials we're studying, but also of who studies it and why and how. So with that comment, I want to introduce Yaron Klein, who is going to chair this first panel today. Yaron is a professor of Arabic at Carleton, right here in Minneapolis. He also is an oud player and a wonderful violin player, as we had the privilege of seeing last night. And thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Shir, and good morning, everyone. I would like to start by thanking Shir for this wonderful, fascinating conference that she organized. And and also thanking all of you participants, presenters, and musicians who came all the way to snowy Minneapolis, widely known as Dunya, right? The center, the mother of the world, competing with Cairo. It is a pleasure chairing this morning's session, which I'm sure will be fascinating. The discussion of music sung and played by Mizrahi Jews in Israel and its connection with Arabic language and Arabic music displays the complexities in Israeli societies, not only of identities, but also in languages, whether linguistics or musical. And just like the Arabic language, so Arab Middle Eastern music has been struggling to find its place within the consensus of Israeli society, as we've heard in papers yesterday. The Piyyut movement played an important role in bringing to the front stage music that has been on the back burner of Jewish Israeli society, alive but consumed in the margins. And as someone who is engaged with Arab music, both as a scholar and as a musician, and also someone who grew up in Israel and left more than 20 years ago, I'm fascinated by the prevalence of Arab and Middle Eastern music, Piyyut included, on the central stage in Israel nowadays. When I grew up in Haifa in the 70s and 80s, this was not the case. I remember the mixed city of Haifa growing up as a very homogeneous place. I grew up playing the violin and was exposed almost exclusively to Western music, with no acceptance, let alone appreciation of music of the Middle East, whether performed by Palestinians or Arab musicians or Mizrahi Jews. I spent my teenager years playing in Haifa's Youth Symphony Orchestra, and I remember that our conductor, whenever we played really bad, would scold us and saying, "You sound like the orchestra of Zuzu Musa." None of us knew who Zuzu Musa was, and we would giggle and just continue playing out of tune as we always did. Only years later, I learned who Zuzu Musa was. Zuzu Musa was one of the lead violinists in Egypt, and for a while played lead violinist for Mohammed Abdel Wahab. And he came to Israel in the 60s and became the conductor of the orchestra, the Arab orchestra of the Israeli radio, which was comprised of a group of superstar Jewish musicians who emigrated in these years to Israel. I share the sentiment that was echoed in Galit's paper and interviews presented yesterday, that a bright future for Israel, if we can still imagine it, will have to include the embracing of the different identities and cultures of those who share the space under the State of Israel. The interactions of the musical traditions in Israel is telling about how these identities interact, and Piyyut is a fascinating case. Let me introduce the presenters. Edwin Seroussi is the Emmanuel Alexander Professor of Musicology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the director of the Jewish Music Research Center since 2000, as well as a visiting scholar at the Dartmouth College since 2007. He has previously taught at the Department of Music in Bar Ilan University and has been a visiting professor at several institutions of high learning in Europe, in North and Latin America. His research focuses on the musical cultures of the Mediterranean and the Middle East, interaction between Jewish and Islamic cultures, and popular music in Israel, exploring processes of hybridization, diaspora, nationalism, and transnationalism. He founded the Yuval Music series and is the editor of the acclaimed CD series, Anthologies of Musical Traditions in Israel. Alongside his academic work, he's active in the musical scene of Israel and abroad in diverse capacities as producer, advisor, member of the board of musical institutions, and representatives to the International Musical Council of UNESCO. He has been awarded several prestige prizes, among them the Israel Prize in the field of musicology in 2018. Shir, I will present everyone right now, I think. Yeah, so Almog Bahar is a poet, novelist, translator, and researcher who now lives in Jerusalem. Bahar published 6 books in poetry, both poetry and prose, the latest being Shemelach Yitbazer al Ahava, Rub Salt into Love. His other books include the poetry collections Tzim'on Be'erot, Well's Thirst, Chut Moshech Min HaLashon, Thread Drawing from the Tongue, Shirim La'asirei Beit HaSohar, Poems for the Prisoners, the short story collection Ana Min Yehud, I Am from the Jews, and the novel Chachla Ve'Chezkel, Rachel and Ezekiel, which was translated into Arabic and published in Cairo in 2016. Our third presenter who will join us, hopefully on Zoom, is Yuval Ivri. He's an assistant professor of Near Eastern and Judaic Studies in the Marash and Ukri, I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, a chair in Ottoman, Mizrahi, and Sephardic Jewish Studies in Brandeis University. He's a cultural historian specializing in Sephardi, Mizrahi, modern history and culture, with a focus on the turn of the century Palestine, land of Israel. His recent book titled The Return to Al-Andalus displays over Sephardic culture and identity between Arabic and Hebrew, was published by Magnus Press in 2020. I look forward to hearing all of these presentations. Thank you.
Good morning. I will breathe deep and hope that I can survive this morning. It's not the first time I am in such situations. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you to all the organizers. Shir, thank you for taking care of us so much. Nathan and all our friends here. Before I start, just a statistical question, so I will know how to proceed with my paper. The name Najara means anything to any of you except Almog? Yeah? Okay. Okay. So I will add a few remarks as I'm talking so that we know what we're talking about. For me, Najara is, I can define that in one word, is simply an obsession. As the evening sets down, pure and reddish, and a hushed wind from the sea approaches, seated in front of us is Shalom ben Shalom in Israel Najara Street. Nathan Alterman, the noted contemporary Israeli poet, is not the first name what we'll associate with the renowned early modern poet, preacher, scribe, singer, composer, and perhaps even woodcraft artisan, Rabbi Israel Najara. I said renowned because Najara has become a contemporary cultural celebrity, if I might say, in what is called today the Piyyut revival, or as one of our dear colleagues present here has named, the Piyyut craze in Israel. And as this conference attests, the Piyyut craze has reached even the extreme confines of the American frontier. I don't have time to play all the materials I have, but I will be love to share with you just a few bars of this celebrity or celebration of Rabbi Israel Najara. Here is arguably his most famous song today in Israel, Ya'ala, Ya'ala, Boi Legani, as performed on the Tikkun, on the night vigil of Leilo Shana Rabbaim Tekoa in 2012 by Barry Sakharov and Ensemble. Just a few bars. The Piyyut website invitation, the Piyyut, more information here from Yair Arel, has dedicated a tremendous amount of energy and materials to celebrate so many aspects of Rabbi Israel Najara. Rabbi Israel Najara also mופיע in films. Here we have Uri Rebach performing Najara, going to the mountains around Safed, meditating. This is a very old film that very few people know, but I was involved in this.
The exiles' longings for redemption sparked their interest in the Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism. The outstanding liturgical poet Rabbi Israel Nahara, who grew up in Safed, was a scion of an expelled Spanish family.
I'm sorry, if you want the reference, the film is in YouTube and you can watch it. Uri is great doing Najara. The towering figure of Rabbi Israel Najara stands at the epicenter of the Piyyut craze. As Almog Behar stated in 2013, I hope you remember Almog, and I quote, if Rabbi Yehuda Levi was the greatest Hebrew poet after King David, then Rabbi Israel Najara was the greatest Hebrew poet after Yehuda Levi up to our days. End of quote. We have theater plays about Israel Najara, a play by Guy Biran, performed at the Zira Ben Humit. There is a dialogue between Najara and his wife. I regretfully don't have time to show you all these materials, just want to show you the extent to what this figure is being pondering now in Israel. Najara's late modern Renaissance, however, is no news. The poet-musician's image and literary output has been maintained alive since he died in Gaza around 1625, and not only by circles of Paitanim in Ottoman and North African Sephardic communities who continue to perform his songs to this day in nightly vigils and festive occasions. As I will show, and this is the topic of this paper, also Ashkenazi scholars and maskilim contributed to keep Najara's memory thriving. Yet, in spite of this widespread interest, more than half of Najara's poetry has never been published and remain in manuscript. And in fact, there is no authoritative edition of any of his vast poetical output, which counts 1,005 poems. This is what Najara himself counted. In one of his poems, he mentions that he wrote 1,005. The forthcoming scholarly edition of She'erit Israel, Najara's unedited late poetry, according to the Codex Cambridge 531-1, edited by esteemed colleague Professor Tova Be'eri of Tel Aviv University and myself, will hopefully start filling this gap. We expect the book to be published by the Mizrahi Institute in 3 months from now, but 3 months may take a little bit more. Here you have how the manuscript looks, and just for you to have a taste of.
This one.
Go this again.
Okay. I don't see that on my screen, but okay, that's okay. So, going back, for you to have a taste of how the poetry looks, Najara organized She'erit Israel according to the makamat, to the Hebrew musical modes. So here you see Makam Buselik, one of the makams of the Turkish Ottoman tradition. He also designated for every song melody in Arabic, in Turkish, sometimes even in Greek, and most important for me, in Judeo-Spanish, which was his mother tongue. He was a descendant, actually second generation of Jews from Spain. And here, the very famous poem that Yair, you remember, we performed, is an amazing poem. I just cannot even start depicting it, but you can see that it's set to the lajan, to the melody, con el vino sanearía yo marido, con el agua pasearé mala, which in Spanish means with the wine, I will get well, my husband, but with the water, I will be very mad. And Rabbi Israel Najara wrote, Ben tavinu liknot bina azinu, con el vino sanearé yo marido, is a play, of course, into the phonetics of the word. So this is how the new edition will look. Every poem is commented with a huge apparatus that speaks about the intertextuality of Najara's poetry, which is immersed in biblical and post-biblical literature. So, returning to Alterman, his aforementioned poem was published in the Daily Haaretz on November 2nd, 1937. Alterman situates the scene described in the poem as a scholar named Shalom ben Shalom, who is detached from the geopolitical realities of British Mandate Palestine to which his son wants to drag him. Reading books of Kabbalah with a Yemenite tune, Benigun Teimani, in Najara Street in southern Tel Aviv, adjacent to the Carmel market. The choice of this location is probably not a total coincidence, because Alterman, as many Central and Eastern European modern intellectuals since the early 19th century, Zionist and not Zionist, was aware of the standing of the illustrious poet from Damascus and Safed. That Tel Aviv has a street, a very humble one, in the peripheries, named after Najara, speaks of a certain recognition that some city officials had for this Oriental poet. They were not alone. Several other cities in Israel name a street after Najara, attesting to the widespread awareness of his legacy in Israel. Yet, as in Tel Aviv, none of these streets are major arteries, but rather unassuming roads a few blocks long each. Through recognizing Najjar as a personality deserving an urban distinction in modern Israel, the administrators of Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Jaffa, Rehovot, Ra'anana, etc., did not invest much real estate in perpetuating the memory of the author of Zemirot Israel, which is Najjar's first book, except for the street named after Najjar in Safed, the city where the poet was most probably born and certainly educated while rising to prominence. His presence in Safed reached a peak with the publication of the first edition of his book, Zemirot Israel, which happens to be arguably, if not the second, then the third book published in the new printing press in the land of Israel. So the fact that one of the very first products of this new technology in Eretz Israel, in Ottoman Palestine, is Zemirot Israel, speaks of the stature of this relatively, at the time, young poet. Stretching from the historical Ari synagogue in the oldest section of the city of Safed, going downhill towards the deep valley surrounding Safed from the north, this particular Najjar Street got its name following a legend rather than by an administrative decision of the city council. Here is the legend as related by Chaim Sidor, an English-speaking tour guide specializing in Safed. And I'm quoting the story as he tells, a little bit abridged for the sake of time. And I quote, many of the Kabbalists living in Safed next to the Ari. Among those who live with the Ari, there was a man named Israel Najjar. Israel Najjar was a paitan, a poet. He wrote songs. He was a mystic. And as the mystics often did, they would walk around the forest surrounding the city in order to do meditation. One day, Rabbi Israel was walking in the forest, and he walked a little bit too far. And all of a sudden, an arm comes out of the bushes, grab him. It was the cutthroats. And they put a knife on his throat and demand his money. Now, Israel Najjar was a poor fellow, like he's a poet. He cannot be rich, and had no money. And he tells them, okay, if you don't have money, your relatives may pay your ransom. Well, he said, I got no relatives with money either. Well, they continue friends. No, I don't have friends with money either. Well, the cutthroats quite don't know what to do, and they look at him and say, well, you better make your prayers and make your peace with God, because we can't let you know. You kill our business. So we are going to cut your throat. And Israel Najjar asked them, well, do you mind if I play one last song for the Lord? They said, okay, go ahead. They are all laughing. They have their knives ready. Rabbi Israel takes his pipes out and begins to play with all his heart and all his soul. He plays with such feeling that the camels and the donkeys of the cutthroats began to dance. As a matter of fact, they began to dance with 2 feet back, with the 2 back feet, I'm sorry. The cutthroats were so frightened, and by this they picked up and ran. But Rabbi Israel was so caught on his song, he didn't even pay attention to that. He stood up and he came walking back to Safed, and he walked through the main road into Safed at the time, and he came up, and according to the legend, he came up in this very road, walking with a whole parade of camels and donkeys dancing behind him. And to this day, this street is called Najjar. Yeah. One does not need to be an expert on Greek mythology to recognize in this story Najara in the role of Orpheus, endowed with a magical power to overcome adversity and subjugate the nature through his musical prowess. Notice that in this story, Najara, the poet, does not sing, but creates instrumental music with wind instruments, pipes, instead of the iconic lyre of Orpheus. Thus, in the folk imagination, Najara is perpetuated also as a musician, no less than as a poet. This legend is just one of many that circulated for the past 3.5 centuries in folk tales that positions Najara as a supernal figure, depicted in many stories as a spark of King David. And here you see the famous mosaic of King David as Orpheus in Gaza. So we have Orpheus, King David, and Rabbi Israel Najara in succession. The great Sephardic Turkish scholar Avraham Danon brings such a story in his important 1896 essay on the Judeo-Spanish song. From times immemorial, and I'm quoting here from Danon, the assistants, maftirim, of our cantors used to meet every Saturday morning before the morning prayers in the Portugal synagogue, which you see here, the main synagogue of Adrianopolis, in order to sing poetry as a musical practice according to the Arabic modes called maqamat. For this tradition, one uses especially the poems by Najara, to which other chants composed later were added. A legend was even created around this subject. One of these maftirim, named Moishe Pardo, or perhaps Moishe Paredes, struck by the moonlight, confusing it with the crack of dawn, arrived one Saturday night to the synagogue and was terrified when he saw a venerable old man seated in the benches assigned to the singers. Trembling, Pardo wanted to withdraw when the old man talked to him with a sweet voice and said to him, "Fear not, my son, I am Rabbi Israel Najara, who, delighted with your zeal for sacred music, came to attend your performances." Then the strange vision disappeared. End of quote. There is a variant of this version in which Najara actually teaches maqams to the Turkish singers in the synagogue. Not only in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Paitanim vividly maintained the figure of Najara. For example, in his Sefer Mekor HaChaim, Toldot Rabbi Chaim Pinto, published in Casablanca in 1975, until then it was in manuscript, Moshe ben Chaim Pinto relates that the great poet Rabbi David Hassin and Rabbi Chaim Pinto the Great, 1743-1845, used to travel each Rosh Chodesh, in the new moon, from Meknes to Mogador, Essaouira, in the south of Morocco, and there Rabbi Israel Najara used to reveal himself in visions. The same Rabbi Pinto one day forgot to go up to sing Bakashot, and he was reprimanded by the voice of Rabbi Israel Najara coming from the Holy Ark. These stories, and many others, nurtured the extraordinary and ever-present figure of Najara in Middle Eastern and North African Sephardic communities. However, the poet's stature grew in Europe too, most especially in Italy, but also in mystical and maskilic circles of Ashkenaz. Of special interest are debates around the transformational power of Rabbi Israel Najara's poetry and on the aesthetic merits of his work. Najara's poetry spread, for example, into Central Europe, particularly to the mystical circles in Bohemia and Moravia. At a very early age, the end of the 17th century, like half a century after he died. And here you have a quotation from the Sefer Tefilot Noraot, Ushvachot Veodaot Zmirot Israel, published in Frankfurt 702 by a circle of mystics. And here, Rabbi Israel Najara, is already defined a Rav Gadol, a Kadosh, a Rav, a Meora Gadol, and so on and so forth. Ve'id Kadosh Rabbeinu Ari Zal. And the Holy Ari testified that Rabbi Israel Najara was Nitzotz Shel David HaMelech, a spark of King David. And I cannot go into how this legend was developed. You can read that in our forthcoming book. Najara's poetry, these stories and gossips from Damascus about the relations between Najara, the Ari, and Rabbi Chaim Vital elicit a rich literature treat elsewhere. Ties between the Najara family in Gaza and the Sabbatean movement were, to a certain extent, the trigger for the diffusion of Rabbi Israel's poetry in Central Europe, although he died way before the Sabbatean movement. Not the least because Najara's poem Igale Kevod Malchutcha was the adopted anthem of the Sabbatean movement. Interestingly, in many Ashkenazi sources, like Yehiel Alperin's Seder Adorot from Minsk, 1769, identified Najara, as you can see, representative of Minhag Italiani, so that is to say, from the Italian tradition. A turning point in the renewed Maskilic interest on Najara was the appearance of the 4th edition of Zmirot Israel in Belgrade, 1836-7, the first one since the big Venice edition of 1600. This enterprise was prompted by the acute shortage of exemplars of Najara's collection among the singers of Bakashot in the area of Belgrade. The erudite Julius First reviewed this new edition, saying, and I quote, "Israel Najara is known to us, to the Ashkenazim, since our early youth, only through one song, the Aramaic song, Ya Ribon Olam. His enthusiastic, melancholic, attractive, and delicate poems remain for us, Ashkenazim, unknown until now." Ashkenazi enthusiasm for Najara reached another peak in 1858 with the publication of Pizmonim, a very partial version of She'erit Israel, initiated and edited by a circle of Philo-Semitic Maskilim in Vienna, based on manuscripts acquired by them in Livorno. So you see also the transmission of Ottoman manuscripts through Livorno, then into Central Europe. The publication, in turn, raised the interest of additional sources of Najara's poetry located in Western European libraries, and here you see a very important article about one of the most beautiful manuscripts of Najara that was in the Portuguese community of Amsterdam at the time, and now is at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. I only made this connection 2 months ago that I realized that he's talking about the manuscript that I found in Cincinnati. And the interest in the Ashkenazi Piyyut spread to all the great scholars of Piyyut in the 19th century, Ashkenazi, of course, Germans, most of them, like Landhus, Amudei Avodah of 1862, in which Najara is a Meshorer Agadol, the great poet, so his fame is very well established. They also led to the publication of unpublished works by Najara. Here we have Mikveh Israel. These are the homilies that Najara used to make every Rosh Chodesh, every beginning of the month in the synagogue in Jubar, in the outskirts of Damascus, published in Pressburg in 1890. Following their encounter with the Eastern communities in the wake of increased mobility of European Jews, travelers, and the first Zionist waves towards Ottoman Palestine, Najara's songs as performed in Eretz Israel, Turkey, Syria, and Iraq were documented in early recordings and in Western musical notation. Here you have one of the early examples of a Turkish, arguably Turkish melody for the Tikkun Natal set to a poem by Najara. Najara's songs even found their way into this call for the documentation of the melodies. He said, we know that the songs are still performed. We have to keep these melodies and document them. And the call to document the singing found, of course, its maximum expression at the beginning of the 20th century with the work of the musicologist Avraham Tzvi Edelson. He wrote a very extensive article. He was in Damascus in order also to retrieve part of the work of Najara, and then he published that in musical notation. Najara's song found even a room in the emerging Zemer Ivri, in the Israeli new folk song. Here you have Najara's song, Yonah Nada Mikina, published in Neginot Zion, one of the earliest songsters published in Jerusalem in 1897. Now, not all is a garden of roses. In his 1907 programmatic essay, Our Young Poetry, Shirateinu Atzeira, Chaim Nachman Bialik writes, and I quote, this is a very famous quote, "The purpose and the strength of the ancient Hebrew was taken from it. Nothing was left of it but the Jewish side and the Jewish oil. This is the diasporic side, strange and distinct, whose second nature is to Jewify, lay ahead in its contact with foreign poetry, even lewd Italian songs and their melodies. Most of the religious poems by Rabbi Israel Najara, their texts and their melodies are distortions and transmutations of this kind. From the Italian Don Juan with a bouquet of flowers in his hand, singing to his signora from behind the window in a spring eve, Rabbi Israel Najara, with the ashes in his head, sings with this very same melody and in the holy tongue towards the Holy One, blessed be he, him and his Shekhinah, in front of the Holy Ark during the midnight vigil, Tikkun Chatzot. Due to the influence of Kabbalah and the exile, the national religious poetry Piyyut reached therefore this kind of bizarre metamorphosis, Gilgul in Hebrew. Bialik's mention of Najara is remarkable. Modern critics, especially many Mizrahi intellectuals, and we have one sitting here, found such remarks deeply offensive, and I do too, as a symptom of the more general condescending attitude, if not straightforward chauvinistic or even racist, Bialik approach to Sephardic and Oriental Jewish cultures. Yet, a deep reading, a more adult reading of Bialik's argument reveals his comprehensive disdain his comprehensive disdain towards what he understood as the overall loss of creativity power of diasporic Jewish culture in general and Hebrew poetry in particular. Hanan Hever referred to this posture of Bialik as a political theology, arguing that Hebrew poetry, the national Jewish poetry, was maintained through the age of exile within religious ritual, succumbing to the whims of synagogue cantors and external models. Bialik mentions in his essay only three religious poets, Eliezer Akalir, Yehuda Levi, and Israel Najara. The special focus on Najara, this long passage, is notable for its musical detail, exposing Bialik's awareness of Najara's poetry as the most representative musical creation of early modern Hebrew poetry. The mention of Italian melodies instead of Turkish or Arabic that are much more predominant in Najara's repertoire is another offhand generalization by Bialik towards the Jewish other. For it is obvious that he actually had in mind Judeo-Spanish songs, so all these are Romance languages, Italian, Spanish, they're all the same. Signora is not a word that he, by coincidence, adapted, because in many of these poems, Shem Nora comes instead of Signora in the original poems. In this sense, Bialik reflects, in a very negative way, the avid interest in Najara by Jewish intellectuals in the Russian Empire. For example, Israel Zimberg included a substantial chapter on Najara in his History of Jewish Literature published in Vilnius in Yiddish between 1929 and 1938. Zimberg's schematic perception of Jewish history as the result of the dialectic tension between the mystical and the rational, struggling for hegemony, led him to position Najara as the most important representative of the mystical end of this binary scheme. Let me end with music. I never give a lecture without playing some music. Let me just play for you an amazing recording. This is Cantor David Huri of Baghdad. Cantor Huri came to Israel in the mid-1950s, and he was extensively interviewed by Edith Gerson-Kivi, who was a German Jewish immigrant ethnomusicologist who came to Israel in 1936. And the encounter between this little German Jewish lady, who I had the privilege of knowing, with Levi, extended for over 3 years. She recorded every piece of music that this famous cantor knew. And among them, many of Najara's songs as they were performed in Baghdad. I just played the recording because you can hear memory kept alive. David Huri is explaining to the German lady, assuming that she doesn't know who the poet is, giving her a little bit background on the poem. And I found this extremely poetical. And here you have also the text of Najara, for those of you who know Hebrew, one of his most beautiful and famous poems for the Sabbath, Yehalel Niv Sefateinu.
הפזמון הזה חבר תור בישראל לג'רה, שהיה רב מיוחד בפרט בעניין השירים, רב גדול שהיה גר בעיר עזה, וחבר אותו לכבוד השבת, והרבה משפחות בישראל קוראים אותו בליל שבת וביום שבת. يهللني مسفاثينو للسامحين بأبينو محول الكل بدبر بي وبراس صار يصورينو وينبو ملختونح منوحا انحلانو وشبث سام برث عالم لأوث بينو وبينينو.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so it's hard to start after a song, right? It's good to finish one lecture with the song, but then I stand up, I need to sing maybe a little to start, but I won't do it, maybe later. So good morning, and thank you, Shir, for gathering us all together here in snowy Minnesota. And as Shir said, my paper title today is Reclaiming Piyyut Beyond the Table, Surrounded by Men, Possibilities of Return in the Poetry of Shva Salhuv. And it is ironic. We're not surrounding the table now, so it's not explicit, but the panel is surrounded by men, but the conference itself maybe went beyond that, and we will be able to discuss that at the discussion at the end, and maybe also about Bialik and Najara question that Edwin raised. So, throughout Jewish history, writing in Hebrew was a male privilege. And we know of only a select few women who wrote Piyyut and non-religious poetry, Sephardic secular poetry in Hebrew, from the emergence of this genre through the 20th century. The lack of women in Hebrew literature throughout such a long period was more radical than the equivalent situation in Arabic and European literatures, because in the various Jewish communities around the world, no institutions were created in which women learned Hebrew and studied canonical Jewish texts. Between the codification of the Mishnah and the 20th century, the majority of poetical works by Jewish women were created in the spoken Jewish languages of Judeo-Arabic, Yiddish, Judeo-Spanish, and others, and were transmitted mostly orally from generation to generation. This meant that the originators remained most of the time anonymous, which is usually the case for collective works. These poetic works were only written down at a much later stage and were not canonized. Some of them were non-religious, and some of them were of a semi-liturgical status, such as eulogies for the dead, pilgrimage songs, songs for Shabbat, and so on. Even after the expansion of women's writing in Hebrew from the 19th century on, the study of many Jewish texts, as well as large parts of Jewish ritual, remained an exclusively male privilege. Thus, until recent times, there was only a limited connection between women's Hebrew poetry, even as after it began to grow, and the Piyyut tradition. Since the 70s and the 80s, there have been wide-reaching changes in the place of women's poetry, as well as Mizrahi poetry and religious poetry within the field of modern Hebrew poetry. While they have been gradual, these changes have been the cause of considerable fear and struggle within Hebrew literature. And though they've altered the map of that literature, which is largely published and read in Israel, they have had only a very slow influence on the shaping of the literary canon, on the historiography of new Hebrew literature, on the design of curricula in schools and universities. It is possible to identify the growing trend of relating to Piyyut in women's poetry as a metonymy for Mizrahi culture, Jewish culture, and tradition. Today, Yuval Ivri, who is speaking after me about the poetry of Chaviv Abdaya, and I will survey the dramatic expansion of this genre of writing over the last 40 years, pointing out the unique character of women's poetry connection to the world of Piyyut and to Sephardi non-religious poetry, and the way in which their work challenges the boundaries between Piyyut, which is largely but not exclusively Hebrew, the Sephardi non-religious poetry, and oral song traditions in Jewish languages, which sometimes also address religious themes. This trend of women writers entering into a dialogue with the world of Piyyut, Sephardi non-religious poetry and oral women's poetry, which is mirrored by the entry of many female writers into dialogue with the world of Jewish texts beyond the Bible, with Mizrahi culture, Judeo-Arabic culture, and Arabic culture in general, is particularly evident in the works of Chaviv Abdaya and Shva Salhuv. The same trend can also be seen in the poetry of Bracha Seri, Amira Hess, Esther Shkalim, Chava Pinchas Cohen, Michal Held, Tehila Hakimi, and many others. I will begin with the work of Shva Salhuv, and Yuval will continue with the work of Chaviv Abdaya. In the writing of Shva Salhuv, Piyyut, together with Sephardi non-religious poetry and Mishnaic texts, serve as models for tradition, for how it is transmitted and how women are included and excluded in it and from it, and also as models for rejoining tradition in roundabout ways. In Chaviv Abdaya's writing, Piyyut, along with the Kabbalah, serve as an inherited tradition, as a model for texts' attempt to mediate between mankind and God, as a reservoir of language, themes, and literary genres, as an alternative to the heritage of the modern Hebrew poetry, and as a background for the writer's attempt to disseminate certain genres and to return to other genres. Shva Salhuv is an author, poet, and art critic. She was born in 1963 in Akir, today Kiryat Ekron, to parents from Libya, and gained a master's in Jewish philosophy at Tel Aviv University. In 1996, she published her first collection of stories, Onat HaMshugaim, The Season of Lunatics. In 2003, she published her first book of poetry, Ir Uneshiya, A City and Forgetfulness. 2005 saw the publication of her first novel, Ma Yesh Lach Esther. Her second book of poetry, Torat HaChituchim, was published in 2011, and in 2016 she published a collection of essays titled Essays on Art and Judaism. Today I will focus on reading her book of poems, Torat HaChituchim. In a prose section of the book, Salhuv describes spending 3 days at the Poetry Festival in Metula, where the main street is, quote, paved with cobblestones, old like old Europe, uprooted and relocated forever in the heart of a mountain in the strange alien East, just as poetry is strange and alien. Referring to Shai Agnon, she writes, the age of our past Judaism is finished. Then we would read, today we write, Tam v'nishlam idan yahadutenu shehaita, she'az haynu kor'im, v'hayom אנחנו כותבים. She writes, if only I did not have to explain, but all the words I will say are an explanation. This pains me. If only I had the courage to explain nothing. But this is what all writing is, an apologia. הלוואי ולא הייתי נצרכת להסבר. אבל כל המילים שאומר הן הסבר, צר לי שכך. הלוואי והיה בי האומץ לא להסביר דבר, אבל זוהי כל הכתיבה, כתב התנצלות. In another prose section of the book, Shulchan, table, Salhuv positions holiness in her parents' generation, in the memorial services held every year for the grandparents in her uncle's house. She describes the men singing Mishnayot, sitting around a long and simple table covered with a white cloth, and on which sit glasses and a bottle of arak, with bare and simple fluorescent light overhead. Quote, the table is surrounded by men, wearing everyday clothing with kippot on their heads. At the head of the table is my uncle Ephraim, my father's eldest brother. He is holding an old book and reading, his deep voice singing a melody rich with endless meaning. The other men, my father, my uncle's sons, his friends, sing with him, Mishnayot. This is the word I learned then, there, at the annual memorial services at my uncle's house. This is his song, unparalleled in its beauty. The letter Taf is pronounced softly, in a whisper, drowned out, Thaf, Mishnayoth. The men sing songs, and the mysterious words are sung by a silent choir, every word carefully pronounced, and all of them woven through with an entirely hidden meaning. It is the depth alone that holds tightly together the circle of men who move gently with the singing reading. My father sings. The ancient reading tightly grips the heart, fills its pumping blood with the echoing whisper of holy joy, Mishnayot. The song that is unparalleled in its beauty, which is transmitted through holy pronunciation, takes place in a space that is entirely male, with the exception of the poet as a girl who does not yet understand the meaning of the words, which are all of them woven through with an entirely hidden meaning, yet has already learned the name, Mishnayot, which the men pronounce with a Judeo-Arabic inflection as Mishnayot. Thanks to her age, the girl is able to cross the gender divide and sit next to her father, swallowed up in the song. But all the others are separated. Quote, the men read, and their voice is a measured song, so mysterious, swaying as they read, books in hand, sitting or standing around the great table. And the women, my aunt, my mother, the neighbors, and the cousins, serve plates peeled high in the large kitchen next door with chickpeas, bottles of juice. They clear away and serve, totally engrossed in their world, their conversations, coming and going. But crossing the divide as a girl did not mean she could become part of the circle of singing men to which she was drawn. I never learned to sing that reading. I learned to read Mishnah in a bare classroom somewhere down functional corridor in the building of the School for Jewish Studies at Tel Aviv University, Binyan Rosenberg, למי שמכיר. She writes, אני מעולם לא למדתי לשיר את הקריאה הזאת. In order to connect with tradition to read Mishnah, Salhuv was forced to find an alternative route to the texts that were learned only by men in her family and did so via the university. But at university, maybe not in this conference, Mishnah is transmitted with no melody, unlike the traditional form of learning. Quote, a scientific, annotated edition placed on a random surface of a narrow alien table, a table topped with bare greenish formica, empty of the past, alienated from the past. Its strange inorganic materialism indicating perhaps the new materialism of the present, in which I hold this Mishnaic order of Moed in my hand, struck by its absolute power to split and divide the temporal continuum with the question that opens the tractate of Ta'anit. From when does one begin to mention the might of the rains? Me'imatai mazkirin gvurot gshamim. Alongside the strangeness of the book in its scientific edition and of the table, the sanctity of the Mishnah, which stems from its language, manages to break through the secular world and rupture the time continuum. The Mishnah lives in the eyes of the poet, quote, I hear nothing, the classroom fades away, an inner soundtrack filled with the beat of that far-off melody is imprinted and sinks into the silence. From when? Since when does a woman hold one of the Mishnaic tractates in her hands? מאימתי אישה אוחזת בסדר מסדרי המשנה? Go through its pages, utterly absorbed in an attempt that turns out to be an infinite undertaking and is drawn to understand the meaning of the words that carved into my flesh the lost voice of happiness. In the language of the Mishnah, Salhuv asks a new question. Since when does a woman hold one of the Mishnaic tractates in her hands? She asked this question in the academic setting in which she is studying the family text, but at the same moment is taken back to the family melody in which the new sentence is uttered. How do you sing this song now, a song that was not passed on to me by my father? איך שרים את השיר הזה עכשיו, שיר שלא נמסר לי מאבי. The kindness of childhood made some room for me to be on the inside, close to him, next to the altar-like table, made holy. But this short period of intermediate time is over and finished. Within the space of traditional Judaism, the traditional Jewish literature for which Salhuv yearns, there exists a clear gender separation according to which men are part of this space and women are outside of it. Only as a girl, as a not yet a woman, could she remain close to this sacred space and close to the song that she did not learn at home and was not transmitted to her, but which she did hear. In her poem, Inflamed Nerve, Etzev Daluk, Shva Salhuv converses with Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's poem, Tzion Lo Tish'ali. Inflamed Nerve. I'll read the short poem. Zion, at the outset of my letter, I will ask after you, how are you feeling? Is everything all right? And how are your prisoners, your Palestinians, your Jews? Tell me, how are the children? And how are your destroyers, O Zion? Zion, will you not ask how I am? I'm not feeling so well. My right hand is withering, the nerve is inflamed. Don't ask. עצב דלוק, ציון, בראשית מכתבי אשאל לשלומך, איך את מרגישה? הכל בסדר? ומה שלום אסירייך? פלסטינאייך, יהודייך, תגידי, איך הילדים? ומה שלום מחריבייך, ציון? ציון, הלא תשאלי לשלומי? אני לא מרגישה כל כך טוב. יד ימין שלי מתייבשת. העצב דלוק. אל תשאלי. The poem is written as a kind of a letter addressed directly to Zion. Unlike Yehuda Halevi, who opens his letter, his poem, with a complaint to the distant and unattainable object of his love, in the name of all those who are prisoners of that love, ציון, הלא תשאלי לשלום אסירייך, דורשי שלומך והם יתר עדרייך, Salhuv instead begins by asking how Zion is, like a forgotten relative who is asked by someone from afar, how are you feeling? Is everything all right? Tell me, how are the children? This swapping of roles between the poet and Zion is ironic and perhaps indicates the changed circumstances of Zion, who once again cannot care for her prisoners and instead needs caring for. But alongside this routine, almost banal context, which is also loving and familial, Salhuv also raises the national contexts via the word your prisoners, asiraich, which here refer to literal prisoners in jail. And how are your prisoners, your Palestinians, your Jews? The poet does not write Palestinians, Jews, but your Palestinians, your Jews. They belong to Zion, and when linked to the following line, it is clear that these are her children. The non-Jewish presence in Zion and even the binational character of Jerusalem stand here in contrast to the lines of a Levi poem written during the Crusaders' occupation of Jerusalem, which describes the Christians who ruled Jerusalem as slaves. את בית מלוכה ואת כיסא אדוני ואיך ישבו עבדים עלי כיסאות גבירייך. After this, Salhuv shifts to the personal by repeating the first words of Halevi's poem, Tzion Lo Tish'ali, Zion, will you not ask how I am? The last four lines are the poet's response to this query. I am not feeling so well. My right hand is withering. The nerve is inflamed. Don't ask. This is a very personal answer. It stands in contrast to the pathos of Yehuda Halevi's poem and to the pathos of the first half of Salhuv's poem, which is read as a harsh and public political protest poem. Inflamed Nerve is also the title of the poem, hinting that Zion itself is an inflamed nerve causing much pain, like the nerve in Salhuv's own body. The poem ends with the words, don't ask, which shifts it into everyday Hebrew. Don't ask, Salhuv writes, as if to sum up Halevi's plea to Zion as redundant or as coming too late. But don't ask is also a sarcastic turn of phrase in everyday language, and thus Salhuv is hinting to a larger story behind her answer to the question, how are you? A story that is perhaps related to the complex relationship with Zion. Throughout her or her work as a whole, and particularly in her collection of poems, Torat HaChituchim, Shva Salhuv adopts several roles vis-a-vis Jewish tradition. On the one hand, she is an inheritor of that tradition, aware of the fact that as a woman, large parts of it were not supposed to have been passed on to her, and that she had to acquire them via the alternative Beit Midrash of the university. On the other hand, she is a transmitter of Jewish tradition, making her own use of Jewish texts, reshaping them, and continuing the chain of passing them on so that the age of our past Judaism will not truly come to an end. The Jewish tradition is not just a familial transmission of the tradition of the Jews of Libya, which Salhuv feels that she inhabited as a girl but is excluded from as a woman, and it is not just the study of Judaism in those new spaces created by modernity, such as the university to which Salhuv makes her way. Judaism is also something that has been appropriated by the state and with which the police, using its language, search the bodies of detainees, as appears in another poem of hers. In relation to all this, Shva Salhuv's poetry takes a complex stance of testimony and memory, but also of transformation, giving all these processes new meaning. That is, she creates a new Jewish tradition. Thank you.
יובל, האם אתה שומע אותנו? כן, אני חושב ש... אני מקווה.
Can we see Yuval?
Can we see who are the people who are on the Zoom conversation?
Yuval, who's presenting now?
Yeah. Yuval, if you can hear us now. Yeah, to the gallery maybe, just for a second, so we see who's on the conversation.
Yeah, and remove the pin so you are not pinned anymore.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, fantastic, yeah.
And Yuval, maybe you're muted?
Or maybe here
Yeah, somehow we can't hear him.
Yuval, can you just try to speak? We can see you right now, but we haven't heard your voice yet.
כן, אתם שומעים אותי בסדר?
מצוין, כן, יופי.
יופי, יופי. ועכשיו אתם גם רואים את המצגת?
כן, רואים את המצגת.
יופי, מצוין. טוב, אז תודה רבה. Thank you very much. I'm really sorry I'm not with you in person. This is wonderful, wonderful conference and really important and unique in many ways. So thank you, Shiv, for the invitation, for organizing it, this quite complex gathering, and for everyone involved in this wonderful process. I know that it took a long time and many efforts into it, and definitely, I was following all the panels yesterday. It's definitely worth it. So thank you. So as Almog said, in many ways, both of our papers are supposed to be connected and in conversation. So I will continue and focusing on Chaviva B'daya. It seems perfectly natural to proceed from discussing Shva Salhuv to talking about Chaviva B'daya. These two important writers share many similarities in terms of their biographies and their work. They are both multidisciplinary artists whose versatile writing cuts across stylistic, linguistic, and thematic boundaries and shifts between prose, essay, poetry, and academic texts. There are also some differences between them. While the symbolic focus in Pedaya's work is Kabbalah and Piyyut, in Shalhuv's work, the focus is more on Mishnah and Arabic. Pedaya's writings are more academic and research-based, and Pedaya also has a greater tendency towards political action and operates as a public intellectual. It isn't an easy task to distinguish between the many types of work produced by Habiba Pedaya. Her poetry is intertwined with and feeds her essays and scholarship. Her poetic texts breathe life into silenced musical traditions and provoke cultural activism that creates original and renewed connection between Piyyut and popular music. It would seem that the most important symbolic arena that finds expression throughout Pedaya's work is the world of Piyyut. Over the last 2 decades, a significant proportion of her diverse activities correspond in some way or another with the Piyyut as a textual and musical tradition. In her books of poetry, there is a strong connection to the language of Piyyut and prayer, as there is in her extensive body of essays and research writing, especially that which focuses on Mizrahi culture. Pedaya has also been heavily involved in initiatives and organizations devoted to the renewal of Piyyut, such as Azmana LePiyyut with Yair Harel, who is present in the conference, and Kilot Sharot organization with Yossi Ohana. She founded and directed the Yonah Ensemble, along with her brother, the Paitan Arav Yehuda Ovadia Petaya. Furthermore, she has pioneered the extension of the study of the Piyyut into a new and unexpected arenas, such as the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem, where she led, together with Meir Buzaglo, a research group on Piyyut, which resulted in publication of an extensive collection of research studies on the subject, which she edited and was published a few years ago. In addition, she organized a series of Piyyut concerts held at the Van Leer Institute from all places. I remember being there for each of one of them, and that was a great change in atmosphere, in which she challenged the separation between the research and interpretation of the Piyyut as a written text and the musical and performative aspects of Piyyut. So, today's lecture will examine the return to the Piyyut in Pedaya's work as a key for understanding her broader cultural and political project to reconnect Judaism to the East, Hebrew to Arabic, written languages to spoken languages, and the musical to the poetic. We can begin our discussion with the biographical context. Habiba Pedaya was born in 1957 to a distinguished Jewish Iraqi family of rabbis, Kabbalists, and Paitanim, which had settled in Jerusalem. Kabbalah and Piyyut were an inseparable part of her upbringing, but were restricted mainly to the familial and communal settings, and were almost entirely absent from the official public sphere, such as the radio, the textbooks in schools, newspapers, and musical halls. This rupture between the Arab-Jewish Mizrahi tradition of her home and synagogue and the hegemonic Israeli culture would become a central theme in Pedaya's writing and research. However, the orientation towards the focus on the Mizrahi culture appears not in the beginning of her writing, but in a particular moment in Pedaya's writing and work, and was not present initially. She described this moment in an interview with Helit Yeshurun, and I quote, but I will just a minute. Let's see if you can. Let's go. Okay. So I'll read in English this quote, but we have also the Hebrew original. One of the first glimmers of Mizrahi Arab Jewish identity was in Ish Holech, a man goes. That poem is the end and a beginning. It marks a turning point. I felt the rising of the Mizrahi, the East, within me. I wrote it in Delphi. On the only occasion I was invited to a Mediterranean poetry conference. There were Arab poets and authors there, and the East was so natural and comfortable, not even, and forced to undergo stages of repression and awakening. The publication of the poem Misholech, A Man Goes, in 1994 in the journal Chadarim was without a doubt a turning point in Pedaya's work. And here you can see the poem in Hebrew, the full poem in Hebrew, but I'm going to now discuss some parts of the poem, and I will bring the parts that I'm going to discuss. I'm going to read some of it in Hebrew. I think it makes sense more, but you will have a translation of the parts that I'm going to read on the slide. The poem represents and embodies the awakening of the Mizrahi, peripheral, and Arab voices in her writing, which were repressed and marginalized and silenced for many years. The poem was published before Pedaya's first poetry collection, but has not included in the book and was included only in her third poetry book. Thus, Isholech, A Man Goes, was a significant moment in the reorientation and return to the Mizrahi culture and Piyyut in Pedaya's poetic and academic writing. As I mentioned, the poem was written following a gathering of Middle Eastern writers held in Delphi, Greece, which Pedaya experienced as a transformative event. The poem is dedicated to the Syrian literary critic Subhi Khadidi, who lived in exile in Paris and would appear to be the man who goes from Damascus to Paris. Ish holech midamask Paris is the first line of the poem. The poem, which begins with the movement of an exiled individual from his country, reveals the direction of such people and even the movement of the earth itself. The East is revealed as a non-place, and rather than being fixed, we discover that it is in constant motion. פתאום ראיתי שהמזרח נודד ואין עמוד תיכון כי אם רועד. Like the ancient rabbinical Knesset and the divine presence, which were exiled from the land of Israel when the temple was destroyed and the people of Israel scattered, the East has also not remained in the same place after many of its residents were exiled, though the poem does not make clear whether it is wandering after them. From this position, Pedaya can also define her own movement as exile. אני הלכתי מרחק שנים מירושלים לבאר שבע, ולא עשיתי כלי גולה, כמו יחזקאל השוכב על צידו במיטה בבבל 365 ימים, ואהובתו מתה בציון בגולה. The exile of the present is constructed on strata of exile, which also contain the prophet Yehezkel, whose grave was a major pilgrimage site in Iraq. It is not only in Delphi in Greece, far from Jerusalem, the city of her birth, or Beersheba, where she lives, and her parents' city in Baghdad, that she feels herself to be in her homeland, part of the space that is all in motion. עכשיו אני מרגישה במולדת, שהרי פתאום הבנתי אדמה זו עד כמה היא זזה היא, ורעדתה כמה לא נוחה, ובין אחי אני טועה. Perhaps surprisingly, despite this notion of constant movement and wandering, she describes herself as among her brothers. Chaviva Pedaya describes multiple movements between Middle Eastern countries and the West, between Israel and Palestine, and between Israel and Israel. ויש ההולכים מעיראק לאמריקה, ויש מלבנון לניקוסיה, ויש מישראל לפלסטין, ויש מישראל לישראל לישראל, ולא מוצאים כלום. ישראל בישראל נעדרת. The movement between Israel and Palestine, which might have been representative of shift in consciousness or historical narrative, is presented as a movement in space, whereas it is in the context of Jewish independence and sovereignty that Israel disappears from within Israel and is seemingly exiled from it. The end of the poem returns the spotlight to the East, which enters the poem as East in broader sense, a Middle Eastern people meeting in Greece, rather than as the narrower Israeli sense of Mizrahim or Mizrach, referring to an internal ethnic division. The concrete geographical coordinates of the East given throughout the poem are many but also blurry. Against the backdrop of the conceptual and geographical confusion associated with the concept of the East, which is simultaneously an ancient Jewish concept, an ancient Arab concept, a Western colonial concept, and a double-faced internal Israeli concept, as well as a critical concept for those who call themselves Mizrahim. The Daya refers throughout the poem to an East that is also wandering and blurred. In the end, it is language, rather than geography, that offers the most concrete ground to stand on. האם תמיד יהיה כך במזרח? או רוח או אדמה. בינתיים, העדיף אמנם לשכון בתוך מילה. בית אחר טרם קיים. ספק אם אי פעם היה. Language is an alternative to a home that does not exist and perhaps is not nostalgically imagined as having once existed. Perhaps poetry itself, which in Hebrew is divided into batim, the words for verses, that also means houses or homes, a usage borrowed from Arabic, can serve as a home and which words are home, in which language. בתוך עבריותי, עברותי, ערביותי, כן שזו מוזיקה רק מתנגנת. שפתיי נעות, אך קולי אינו נשמע, שכן זו השפה שבה קיללו ואהבו הגדולים. ממנה סולקתי כדי להיפדות. עברי דבר עברית, עכשיו בכל זאת צועק המזרח. The poem moves between a series of contrasts. The poet's voice is not heard, but the East can howl. Hebrew and Arabic are intertwined, but what links them is blindness. The poet has banished from Arabic, so she could be saved by Zionism, and is confronted with the slogan of the revival of Hebrew. Hebrew, speak Hebrew. Ivri, daber Ivrit. Language is compared to music, which blurs the differences between Hebrew and Arabic, like Jewish Piyyutim within the Arab world. Subsequently, Pedaya writes, זו השפה שבה קיללו ואהבו הגדולים. This is the tongue in which the elderries cursed and loved. But we do not know whether this refers to Hebrew or Arabic, or a combination of the two, as in the bilingual Matruz poetry in the Piyyut tradition. Nor do we know who are the great ones, references in the poem, the great Piyyut poets and performance of the past, or the Arab poets, or perhaps it refers to the great singers of the Arab world in the 20th century, or even the poets' relatives from earlier generations. In Nurit Abib's documentary, משפה לשפה, from language to language, Chava was one of the interviewers there. Chavib Daya explains her relationship with language and music. And again, I will read it in Hebrew, and you have the English translation in front of you. בשבילי שפה זה הרבה מעבר למספר מילים מסוים. זה מוזיקה, תחביר, הנשמה של הדברים, הרוח של הדברים. זה הדבר העיקרי שדרכו אני חווה את המוזיקה של המזרח. מה שנתפס כמוזיקה מזרחית זה בשבילי גם קודם כל מוזיקה דתית. המוזיקה שאני רגילה להתפלל בה מאז שהייתי קטנה. הדבר הכי ראשוני של ההבעה, של כאב, של צער, של געגועים. And regarding Arabic, in the same interview, she explains, ערבית היא עבורי באיזשהו מקום שפה מתגמגמת בה. היא שקועה בתוכי כשפת שמיעה, היא לא ממש שפת הדיבור שלי. היא כאילו שתי שפות, עברית וערבית, שאני נעה ביניהן. בעצם אני מדברת על עבריותי וערביותי כשתי מהויות שבאמצע מחברת ביניהן נקודת עיוורון, אזור שכחה, אזור נטוש. This forgotten and abandoned borderland between Arabness and Hebrewness become a contact zones that opens a gateway to the language of the heart, Sfata Alev, which breaks out through a crack, an echo, a prayer or musical makam in a piyyut. The rupture and the tension between Hebrew and Arabic are the starting point of Pedaya's work, and also a gateway to the possibility of prayer, of reaching for the sublime. For Pedaya, the connection between Hebrewness and Arabness is made possible by the connection between text and music. Not just any music, but Mizrahi and Arabic music as part of religious music. The poem Isholech also opened the channel for writing for Chavir Pedaya in a new way. And since then, the publication of the poem in 1994, Chavir Pedaya rich and prolific output includes 5 books of poetry, 6 books of scholarly research. She was also involved in editing of 2 collections of academic articles. In addition, over the last 2 decades, Pedaya also published an enormous number of articles in the field of cultural and literary criticism on topics including Mizrahi music, Hebrew poetry, and the Israeli periphery, especially Beersheba. Thus, for example, in the article Al Kol HaGoleh, the Exiled Voice, she writes about the need for an independent place for Judeo-Arab music, after a long period in which it was silent. A poetry manifesto that Pedaya authored, titled "The Time Has Come to say that I am different" in Hebrew poetry, became the subject of much debate. It called for going beyond the universal I, as expressed by the poet Natan Zach, to more a concrete I, connected to migration, to the periphery, to place, to the languages of exile, and to the Jewish tradition. Pedaya wants to reconnect the traditions and culture which were split apart. Piyyut is both a written and performative culture, but in the Israeli context, the written and spoken or sung forms of the tradition have been separated. Pedaya has attempted to recouple these 2 components and create a new intersection of voiced and written text. She believed that and I quote, the characteristics of society, its way of life, and its culture become consolidated around the culture of performance. The written of text, the adoption of music, the weaving of the Hebrew and Arabic languages and music into one body. All these are intertwined with multiple issues, questions of religion and secularity, as well as layers of culture, communal culture, colonialist culture, metropolitan culture, popular culture, and high culture, women's culture and men's culture. By turning to the Piyyut, Pedaya demonstrates the possibility of another role for poetry. Instead of being read by individuals in a closed room, she highlights the musical and performative dimensions of the poems and their place in communal ritual as part of collective poetic tradition. Furthermore, it does not accept the centrality of Israeli Hebrew, and instead engage also with rabbinical Hebrew and Aramaic, nor does it accept the linkage of New Hebrew literature with European literature, but instead consciously engage with the long history of Jewish-Arab cultural interaction, and in the musical context, the Jewish-Arab-Sufi interaction. In the summer of 2014, during the war between Israel and Gaza, if you can call it a war, it's more an operation, when the discourse of revenge and racism between Jews and Arabs and between Jews and Muslims was in its peak, Habiba Pedaya organized a series of events in southern Israel called Tikkun Gvulot, Mending Borders. These events featured musicians, Jewish and Muslim religious figures, and intellectuals. And a notable aspect was the use of Piyyut and Judeo-Arabic music as an attempt to provide a shared meeting place. The first event was held in Beersheba and was defined as a peace-talking musical rally. Ahead of the event, Pedaya wrote, "The discourse among the musicians will foreground the desire to create a concrete shared place, inspired by the shared Jewish-Arab musical space, to create a delicate conversation based on spirituality, respect, and recognition of current reality, to create contact between Jewish and Arab Sufism." For that first event, Habiba Pedaya wrote new words for the popular Piyyut by Rabbi Shlomo Ibn Gabirol, Shalom le-Ben Dodi, and the Paitanit, Rekefet Amsalem, performed this new version of the Piyyut poem to the existing melody. This act of writing new Piyyut poems using existing Piyyut melody is also common, and in the past was paralleled by setting Piyyut to the new Arabic melody. So in many ways, it's the reverse way in that sense. And in many ways, this event was also a symbolic moment of bringing the Piyyut into a political arena. And of course, the question of Palestine, the question of the relation between Palestinians and Israeli Jews, and so on. Conclusion. Throughout her writing, Habiba Pedaya moves between Kabbalistic text and Piyyut, and her work challenges the rupture between the tradition of Piyyut and Arab, Jewish, and Mizrahi culture on the one hand, and the new Hebrew poetry on the other. Her poetry represented a combination of several trends that have become more and more central since the 1980s. Women's poetry, Mizrahi poetry, and religious poetry. From her location at the meeting point of these three trends and the respective worlds of content, Pedaya offers new and radical possibilities to Hebrew poetry, its languages, its forms, its sources of inspiration, and its central themes. The return to Piyyut and to Arab, Jewish, Mizrahi culture in Pedaya's work is part of a broader political and cultural project which aims to remap or to reorganize the Hebrew and the Israeli cultural canon. In the national Zionist context, the project aims to create an alternative to the rejection of exile and the reduction of Jewish religion and identity into a national culture or national identity, and the description of Arabs as the others or the enemies. Instead, in Pedaya's work, the return to the Piyyut and to the Jewish Arab culture becomes a platform for reclaiming Mizrahi and Jewish identity, offering possibilities for a spiritual connection between Judaism and Islam. Thank you very much.
I'll go around with the mic.
Yes.
I think we'll run a little bit over, so we'll have maybe 10, 15 minutes for
maybe
questions.
we can ask all of the presenters to join the Zoom screen. And please, if anyone want to start with a question, please.
Thank you so much for these papers. My question is particularly for Yuval and Almog. I heard you situating Shvas Al-Hub and Habiba Pedaya in relation to the Jewish tradition, and its patriarchal order. And I heard you situating them in relation to the Zionist order. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how they are situated in relation to criticism, particularly to Mizrahi criticism, as evolved, particularly in the 90s, around, for example, around a journal like Teoria Vebikoret, Theory and Criticism, and what might be framed as the secular orientation of this critical trend. Thank you.
So I'll try to start, and then Yuval, you can add. I think, you know, Chaviv Apdaya was part of new Mizrahi discourse since the 90s to the present, with a criticism to its secular perspectives that were dominant in the beginning. In that sense, like when the work on the Piyyut, for example, with the group in Van Leer was made in the beginning, like in 2005 or 2006, it was clear that it was trying to enter both the Jewish language and questions coming from Piyyut, from a Masorti perspective, a traditional perspective, and it should be said that it was also very influential. I think that it influenced the kind, in the sense that in critical theory in Israel, like the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s is marked by the relationship to post-colonial discourse in general. And in a sense, like what Chaviv Apdaya suggested to it, I think, was adding the local, but also in a sense like saying that, you know, post-colonial discourse through the English and French won't be enough if not corresponding to rabbinical Hebrew and to Arabic. Shvas Alhuv was more, I think, distant to this, those polemics. Like, I think she is close to thinking that a redefinition, right, like the word Zion repeated in the poems that we read from Shvas Alhuv and from Chaviv Apdaya. So reorientating what does the word Zion means, right, before being appropriated by modern Hebrew is an important project to both of them in that sense. So if Yuval wants to add, right?
Okay, yeah, I don't want to take much time. Yeah, I think that you pointed out some of the important aspects. I will only say that in many ways, if going back to what Edwin Sarusi said yesterday in the other panel, that there is trends that Chaviva didn't invent it. She's connecting to other trends that Mina Almog also worked in maybe different projects in the end of 19th century, early 20th century of Sephardi intellectuals that saw going back to Judaism as going back to the East, as something that goes together. Of course, Andalus was one of the models, and Arab and Hebrew, even reviving Hebrew, people that were part of this kind of project of reviving Hebrew or reviving Hebrew literature and poetry saw themselves going together with Arabic as the model, as Judaism as part of the East. And I think in that sense, Chaviv Apdaya is bringing back these kind of voices that were Mizrahi voices, early Mizrahi voices, maybe vis-a-vis the Zionism and the secular project of in Palestine that were against this kind of notions of going to the Protestants, Christian, Jewish traditions, and of course westernizing Jewish culture and Hebrew culture. So they of course were trying to bring a different kind of mode. And I think Chavov Daya and Meir Buzaglo and others are connecting to this kind of voices. And of course, in the traditional life, I don't know if it's traditional, but of course the Piyyut and Paitanim continue this in the synagogue, this kind of connection continues. So in many ways, Chavva it definitely emphasized this kind of notions and brought it into the discussion, very important discussion in that sense.
Please, Peter.
So thank you all. Those are three terrific talks. I guess I have two comments. One's more of a comment than a question, comment and question for Edwin. Just to follow up on what Yuval was just saying, it is interesting that in our imaginations, right, and Andalus is an imaginaire, right, is an imaginary, a mental space. We think of it as the East, but of course it's the uttermost edge of the West. And within Andalus, there's the East and the West. There's Hanagid and Ibn Gabirol and Ibn Ezra in the North and South. And then there's Halevi rejecting all that. And this stuff didn't happen in the East, it happened in the West. I think that's an important tension to hold and keep in mind. So my comment and question for Edwin is more this. First of all, I really look forward to this critical edition that you're doing with Tova. I've heard a great deal about it from her. The great Bialik quote that you fished out of that early essay, the 1907 essay, it's an interesting point that in that essay, he also doesn't appreciate Yehuda Halevi, really. He talks about the Zchuchit Shvora, or something, I don't remember what the Hebrew is, but the broken glass of Hebrew poetry, of Andalusian poetry, and the meters as shackles around the feet of the poet. In other words, he, in his early 30s, or whatever he was then, is still very much a neo-romantic Russian poet encountering this other poetry, and he's really not able to appreciate it. And then it's only with the project of the Kinus, with his Ibn Gabirol project, and then the discovery of the Diwan by Hanagid, by Sassoon, where he goes crazy and really starts to get, he sort of his aesthetic changes. As his own poetry is beginning to die out, right? He's no longer, in a certain sense, or I'm speculating, but in a way, that neo-romantic Russian in him is somehow receding. So he revised his attitude toward the Andalusian poets in a major way over the course of the next 20 years. But I don't know, I'm curious, have you encountered, did he revise his picture of Najara in any way as that project of Kinus evolved for him?
The picture of what? Of
Najara as, you know, the way you described him, the pejorative, the way he denigrates Najara's poetry and makes fun of this strange yoking of the Ladino or of the other foreign poetries that he's calquing, right? Yeah. Bialik is dismissing that. Did he in any way revise that opinion later on in his writing life and his work on the project of Kinus? That's my question.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that's a question that can be answered in many ways. But certainly I mentioned the intertextuality of Najara's poetry and what it means. And one has to be aware that certain strands of the Andalusian Piyyut remain in practice. So there is a consciousness of continuity of practice, which is for me the important issue. The Piyyut as an abstraction versus the Piyyut as a practice that continues even through the disruptions such as the expulsion from Spain and any other type of discontinuities or relocations that creates this sense that you are always talking to the past. So Najara knows the poetry of Yehuda Levi for sure, because he quotes it. Internally, you have to know a lot. Today we have much more databases that we can compare strings of words, certainly Ibn Ezra. But if you take a contemporary of Najara, which was one of his main foes, Rabbi Menachem di Lonzano, so he has a passage where he speaks about the canon of poets that are being performed in the Ottoman Empire in his time. For example, a very important poet that did not survive until our contemporary period in research, but did not survive so much in practice and was very important, was Shlomo da Piera, which was from the very last generation of poets in Saragossa, in Aragon. And he was a model for Najara, and he's quoted, and he's also mentioned by De Lonzano as an important poet. So you have this movement of going forward and backs all the time in poetry, which in a way continues into Habiba Fadaya in a way too, because she's always going back to goes forward. I hope that that answers something of your question.
It doesn't part, I guess, the extent, just to clarify, my question is, Bialik kind of wasn't able to go back and forward in commenting on Najara.
Yeah.
At any point after that 1907 essay, did he catch up with himself and appreciate Najara?
Yeah, he had a very complex relationship with the circles of, particularly the elites of Sephardic Jewry, both in Jerusalem and outside Jerusalem. One very important episode, this is something very telling of Bialik's contradictions. He wrote an epistle, a letter, an introduction to the most important collection of Piyyutim of the Ottoman Empire that reached the press. You see, until 1921, all the Paytanut in the Ottoman Empire was via manuscripts. In 1921, the book Shirei Israel Be'eretz Akedem, the Song of Israel in the East, is published. It's a diwan, like basically based on Najara's idea, is divided by maqams. That is the rationale of the book is music. And by the way, there are many quotations there of more recent Turkish music, more recent even Sufi compositions, Mevlevi compositions from the 18th and 19th century. And Bialik arrives to Istanbul, and he goes to the synagogue, and he listens to this music, and he writes in that introduction, from this wellspring of sound, the revival of Hebrew music is going to come. So, of course, you can interpret that as a neo-romantic or even certainly as a sort of Orientalistic expression, but on the other hand, he praised that sort of aura of antiquity that the music, this strange music he was hearing, and I can assure you that in Bialik's years this music was very strange, that still he positioned the music as a possibility. This is a very Zionist move, by the way, okay, of looking for the well springs of authentic Hebrew culture in the Eastern traditions. It's a very important trope. However, a few years after, he gives a lecture to the young elites of Sephardim in Jerusalem, and he says, I was in Istanbul 10 years ago, and they're all ignorance. Their Hebrew is horrible, you know, and he starts on and on. So he forgot what he said about the music as a wellspring. So listen, the modern Zionism and Zionist culture is all about contradictions. It's all about contradictions. And here you have a nice example of such contradictions.
we're running out behind time, so we're going to have one more question.
Maybe the questions are more important than the answers, so we can hear all the questions and answer only one.
Let's hear a question. Let's go for that.
Let's hear all the questions, and
Yeah.
each person can choose what to answer.
Hi, thank you so much. Really great to hear you. So I'm beyond the table surrounded by men. I'm wondering if any of these women give voice to the words that we heard spoken by you, if they're sung. I'm thinking about my friend artist Laura Kislasi, who's working in Brooklyn, and she's performing Piyyutim by her great-grandfather in secular spaces and also in synagogues. And so I wonder if that's happening anywhere that you know of in Israel.
We're collecting questions.
Thanks. This is a question, I think specifically for Almog, but maybe it applies more broadly. So you mentioned a lot of kind of dialogue with other poets or with other Jewish texts in Salhuv's poetry, and which is dialogue with, well, basically other men writers, and I'm wondering if there's any aspect of dialogue with poetry or spoken text by women that might be there or that you can speak to.
Shir, we have one question here. Yeah.
The question was for me or for you?
I thank you all for what you brought forward, and I have a two-part question. One is to find out if any of you are familiar with the American woman poet also writing in Hebrew named Marcia Falk. And my other question is about performance, since we're talking so much just on music, but you've mentioned locales, streets, cities, and I just wanted to ask especially Professor Sarusi if you've considered the place of Yardena Cohen as a change maker between Arabic and Hebrew, Sephardic and Israeli, and all of these new definitions of where is Zionism.
I will also add a comment, just one comment to from you, responding to something that Yuval you mentioned, but actually the idea of the musicality of the language and the feeling of muteness that Almog also has a poem addressing that question. I saw a translation into Arabic. It was Lugati Kharsa, I think you wrote something like that. So this idea of poetry, maybe I was thinking about there's different perceptions of poetry in the Arab tradition, and perhaps if I can say something as general in the Western European world, a perception of Adonis, for example, wrote a very interesting essay about poetry, poetics, and he's saying that Arabic poetry has to have a sound. It is meaningless without a sound, and you cannot envision, like you can maybe in European poetry, people just looking at a book and reading silently. And this might mean that this feeling of feeling without a voice that many Mizrahi poets in Israel feel of not being able to express them with a sound, has also this deep conscious or subconscious feeling of disconnection from a kind of expression and livelihood of poetry that exists in Arabic. So I don't know what you think about it. Yeah, now we can try to answer some of those things. Please.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I think that one of the changes, which is longer than this Piyyut revival of the last 20 years, but is certainly central in it, is of women who perform Piyyutim. And like yesterday we heard or saw at least like Maureen Nehdar's album. So you have quite a lot of women who perform Piyyutim, and also who perform women's song in Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Spanish, Judeo-Persian, and so on. In poetry, I think that, like the poet, for example, Michal Held, which could be connected to the poets that we spoke about, in her poetry, negotiating with women's songs in Judeo-Spanish is very central, right? So it's less central with Chaviva Pdaya and Shvas Al-Hub, but it certainly happens in other places. And in that sense, it's also answering like the question of who are they in dialogue with, right? With men, like what kind of text? So I think that many times with poets, like through the family memory comes the dialogue that is alternative to all those men texts. But through the poetry of Michal Held, for example, so also the oral tradition of women in Judeo-Spanish is very central in dialogue.
You can even go earlier. The women's voices performing Piyyut and even prayers goes back to Brachat Sfira. Okay, so we're talking about now the 1930s. Slightly later on, Shoshana Damari. These are women who open a space, I should say, a space that didn't have organic continuity after them. We're still talking about British Mandate Palestine. Now, the more I'm digging into that, I realize that this was a moment of difference, that after the establishment of Israel, many trends were discontinued or at least evolved into something else. Both Brachat Sfira and Shoshana Damari, in a way, they engage in ethnography of men, so they were learning the music for men. In the case of Brachat Sfira, there is an incredible document of her relations between Yitzhak Eliyahu Navon. So now you see what I mentioned before. Yitzhak Eliyahu Navon was the main force. He was a poet, a Turkish Jewish poet, journalist, and he was the main force behind the book I mentioned before that Bialik wrote the introduction, Shirei Israel Beretz Akedem. In the late 1920s, he's a man already of 80 years old, blind. He arrives to Tel Aviv, and Brachat Sfira goes to him to learn what he called the songs of the dervishes, okay, on a bench on Rothschild Street in Tel Aviv. So you can imagine this young Yemenite origin woman sitting with this old Turkish poet, transmitting the lore of Turkish Jewish Paitanut, and then she processed that with different collaborations with German Jewish immigrants who arrived at the time and become the arrangers of her songs. So you have a translation of a translation, an encounter of bodies and individuals and of genders that are part of that dislocation that Zionism creates, and these encounters which are inconceivable before that. So that's important to know, that you have these antecedents, and those voices, Shoshana Damari goes into Moshe Vilensky, etc., and she, here and there, she performs Piyutim from the Diwan, the Yemenite Diwan, but not that much. And as we heard yesterday, in the Yemenite community, is very interesting, the issues of gender dislocations, because not only what we heard yesterday, but even before, like Aaron Amram, who is a great paitan and cantor, but his repertoire of his songs, his original, so to speak, Yemenite songs, are women's songs. They are oral traditions from women that he performs in new arrangements. And when he composed on the basis of the genres of women and not so much piyutim. Okay, so we have these translocations, gender translocations, that are fascinating. I can go on, but...
Yeah, so unfortunately, yeah, we could have gone 2 more hours. Should we vote of continuing the session for 2 more hours? Oh yeah, sorry, Yuval, yeah.
Yeah, I will be brief. I know that, but it's a great question, the idea of the musicality of language. So I will just say that it's part of a broader project that me and Almog is working on as well. But the first thing that will come to mind, of course, when you're reading the text, it's the music of Arabic can come into Hebrew. If you go into a Yemenite synagogue, if you go into a Syrian synagogue, if you go into Iraqi, that's the way that the Arabic music is still there and continue. Even what Edwin Sawissi brought to us in the end of his the Iraqi cantor, when he's even speaking, is different kind of Hebrew. So the text written seems to be like a unified Hebrew, but when of course the spoken layers of it is another. Another thing that I will say is the Arabic have these 2 layers of course, the Fusha and the spoken. And in the spoken, of course, that's a place of heteroglossic sense of multi-dialects into it and so on and so forth. So in that sense, it's very important. And the last thing that I would say that is the sense of what we call the position of most of the Mizrahi Jews today, the young generation, that they can't really speak Arabic and can understand Arabic, definitely not read Arabic, but to listen to Arabic have a different kind of sensation in that sense, and I think it's very important. It's like the post-vernacular in many ways. People talk about it in the Yiddish sphere, but definitely you can see it in Arabic around the Mizrahi Jewish sphere. People are more listening to Arabic as a language of bringing back memories without understanding everything. So of course the musicality of the language is very important.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone. Shia, you probably want to tell us when are we reconvening. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm sorry we ran over time, but it was worth it because we all learned a lot. We're going to take a short break, let's say 10 minutes, get some coffee, get some carbs, and we'll come back with Rafael and Daniel. Okay, thank you.
תודה, אדפין, היה מרתק, ממש. והסוף, לא ידעתי את הסיפור הזה על ברכה סרי שיושבת איתו, זה רגע... כן, סליחה. כן, דור אחר ברגע אחר. אבל זה רגע מדהים, כלומר גם איך היא ידעה שהוא הגיע לתל אביב ובחרה דווקא בו כמוסר. היה לו שם דבר. ויש באותה תקופה יוצא לאור כתב עת למוזיקה שנקרא הימל. יצאו רק 3.
Oh, I actually had a different idea that came up yesterday. I was talking with Peter about Iman Mosad's new translation. Robin Cresswell is publishing a collection by Iman Mosad. Yes, and she is very invested in talking about places. Can we invite her to the Arab series?
כן, נכון.
Perfect.
גם תל אביב הייתה קטנה.
תל אביב הייתה קטנה, ואנשים מסתובבים ושואלים.
She's in Alberta.
תודה רבה.
Yeah, Edmonton, or something like that.
כבר אתה רוצה את הג'ארה באנגלית?
Yes.
כן, בוא אני אגיד לך מה, אני החלטתי...
הוא מוכן להוציא מהדורה דו-לשונית עכשיו, טורקית, תלת-לשונית.
תשמע, זה 4, by the way,
I know. No, and we wanted to have her.
פיוטים מסוימים שמופיעים במחזורים.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if she is, but Sonali claims her. Like, remember?
יש כמה עשרות פיוטים של ג'ארה שתורגמו בהקשרים שונים.
אינטרקול שתשמע אותו.
כן.
לורה ליבר.
אוקיי, לורה, רגע. סליחה. אז אני אגיד לך, יש לו שירותי מודיעין, הוא מהמוסד.
על מי שעושה את זה עכשיו.
הוא יודע סוד. אנחנו הזמנו תרגום של כ-40 פיוטים. לספר באנגלית שהוא לא מהדורה שלי. אני החלטתי לכתוב מה ששמעת. ההרצאה הזאת זה פרק מתוך ספר באנגלית אין מילה
Yeah.
כתובה על נג'ארה באנגלית. אז החלטנו לעשות אפנדיקס, כן, אז
מתוך 40, מתוך כמה?
מתוך 419.
וואי.
זה, אבל גם 40 זה מהפכני וקשה לתרגם את הפיוטים.
קשה מאוד לתרגם, והיא עשתה עבודה נפלאה.
אני מחפש תרגום טוב של ירד דבש. No puedo encontrar.
ירד דבש.
¿Quién tiene una traducción? Lo queremos poner en libro, nadie
לי יש תרגום במאמר, זה לא ירד דבש, המאמר הראשון שלי, תשמע, el primer artículo que escribí sobre el peshref como género de la poesía hebrea, la música, y como ilustración hay un piyyut de Najara, pero no me acuerdo cuál, pero en inglés is asleep in the lapse of desire. Yo te lo voy a conseguir. ישנה בחיק ממתקים. ישנה בחיק ממתקים. Y ese texto fue adaptado a un peshref turco y entonces y lo tradujo una chica fantástica, un poco que vivía en Israel en aquella época y que hoy es la directora del Hebrew Section del Library of Congress, Anne Brenner. Y Anne תרגמה גם, היא כתבה דוקטורט על יהודה לוי עם הרבה תרגומים שהם קבורים בדוקטורט שלה ואחר כך כתבה ספר. אן ברנר, והיא מתרגמת מדהימה. והתרגום שלה על הפיוט הזה, ה-Sleep in the Lapse of Desire, in English,